The sound of the pickaxe striking limestone rang out across the valley floor, a sharp, rhythmic clinking that seemed to offend the quiet of the late autumn afternoon. Arthur wiped a layer of gray dust from his forehead, his breath pluming in the crisp air as he surveyed the shallow cave he was expanding. He wasn't building up, he was digging in. To his left, the sheer face of the canyon wall rose 100 feet, a natural windbreak that the locals ignored in favor of the flat, grassy plains closer to the creek. Arthur swung the pick again, the vibration traveling up his arms and settling into his aching shoulders. He was a man of few words and methodical action, a rancher who had learned the hard way that the wind on these plains was a thief that stole heat, cattle, and hope with equal indifference. He paused as the sound of hoofbeats approached, the heavy thudding of a horse navigating the rocky scree at the base of the slope. "Mister?" Henderson sat high on his chestnut mare, looking down at Arthur with a mixture of pity and amusement. Henderson was a man who believed in straight lines, clapboard siding, and doing things the way they had always been done back east. He adjusted his hat, squinting against the glare of the sun hitting the white rock. "Arthur," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the distance, "I came to see if the rumors were true. The boys at the supply post said you were digging a hole to live in like a badger." Arthur rested his hands on the handle of the pickaxe, looking up calmly. "Not a hole, Thomas. A hearth. The rock holds the heat." Henderson chuckled, a dry sound that grated more than the dust. "It's rock, Arthur. It's cold. You put a house out on the flat, you get 4 walls and a roof. You dig into that cliff, and you're just making a tomb with a view. Winter's coming. Real winter. Not that dusting we got last year." Arthur didn't take the bait. He turned back to the wall, running a gloved hand over the strata of the stone. "The wind hits the flat at 40 miles an hour, Arthur said, his voice level. "Up against this wall it breaks. The stone soaks up the sun all day. By nightfall it radiates back. It's simple physics." Henderson shook his head, wheeling his horse around. "Physics don't keep a man warm, Arthur. Wood and iron stoves do. You're grieving, and I get that. Losing Mary. It creates a fog in a man's head. But don't drag the boy into your confusion. If you get froze out up here, you come to my place. We got a proper parlor." Arthur watched him ride away, the stinging comment about Mary sitting heavy in his chest. He gripped the pickaxe tighter. It wasn't confusion that drove him to the canyon wall. It was the memory of Mary shivering under 3 quilts in their drafty shanty on the plains, her lips blue as the fire died down. He swung the tool again, burying the point deep into the rock. He wouldn't fail the boy. The sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, casting long purple shadows across the work site. 7-year-old Ben sat on a flat boulder nearby, organizing a pile of smaller stones by size. He was a quiet child, possessing the same watchful eyes as his mother, eyes that seemed to see more than they spoke of. "Pa?" Ben asked, holding up a jagged piece of quartz. "Mr. Henderson sounded mad." Arthur stopped his work, leaning the pickaxe against the wall and walking over to his son. He crouched down, his knees cracking audibly in the silence. He took the stone from Ben, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "He's not mad, Ben. He's scared. People get scared when they see something they don't understand." Arthur looked up at the overhang of the cliff, which jutted out 10 feet above them, providing a natural roof that no shingle could match. "We aren't building a house for Mr. Henderson. We're building a house for us." Arthur stood and motioned for Ben to follow him to the designated hearth area. The back wall of the cabin was the living rock itself, cleaned and smoothed. Arthur had spent weeks identifying the fault lines, ensuring nothing loose would fall. Now he began to explain the layout, his voice softening. "See this curve here, Ben? This is where the stove goes. But we aren't just putting a stove in. We're building a stone jacket around it. The fire heats the jacket heats the wall, and the wall heats us while we sleep. It was a lesson in thermodynamics delivered in the vernacular of survival. He could almost hear Mary's voice whispering in the wind that swirled harmlessly overhead, telling him to keep going. She had always loved the strange beauty of the canyon, the way the light played on the walls. She had been the one to point out how warm the rocks felt even after the sun went down. This build was an act of devotion, a physical manifestation of the promise he had whispered to her gravestone. He would not let the cold take anything else from him. The wind picked up, howling along the canyon rim high above, a lonely, shrieking sound. But down here, in the lee of the cliff, the air remained still. Arthur placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Grab the bucket, son. We need to mix the clay and lime before the light goes. We have to set the anchor bolts tonight." Ben nodded, his small face set in a look of serious determination. They worked in tandem, the sorrow of their loss transformed into the rhythm of labor. Every stone laid was a defiance against the coming winter, and every bucket of mortar was a seal against the judgment of a town that thought they had lost their minds. Progress was measured in inches and aches. By the time November hardened the ground, the structure had taken a bizarre but formidable shape. It did not look like a house. It looked like a scab growing over a wound in the earth, rugged and organic. Arthur had to solve problems that no carpenter in town had ever faced. The primary challenge was marrying the hewn logs of the front wall to the uneven face of the cliff. You couldn't just nail a board to a mountain. He had described the timber, using a compass to trace the undulating profile of the rock onto the wood, then carefully carving away the negative space with a draw knife and adze until the log fit flush against the stone like a puzzle piece. It was slow, exacting work that required a patience born of necessity. The community chorus, as Arthur mentally referred to them, made it a Sunday ritual to ride by and gawk. A group of 3 ranchers paused on the trail one afternoon, watching Arthur hoist a heavy ridgepole with a crude pulley system he had anchored into the rock face. "Look at that slant," one man jeered, pointing to the roof line that sloped sharply to shed snow. "He's building a root cellar for people." Another laughed. "Hey, Arthur, you expecting a war? That looks more like a bunker than a home." Arthur didn't look down. He was focused on the tension in the rope, the creak of the timber as it rose. He needed the angle to be steep. The snow load here could snap a standard roof like a dry twig. He secured the beam, wiping sweat from his eyes despite the 40-degree air. Ben was down below, handing up iron spikes. The boy had stopped waving to the passers-by weeks ago. He had learned that their waves were often accompanied by shaking heads. "Does it fit, Pa?" Ben called out, his voice thin in the vast space. Arthur checked the joinery. The wood kissed the stone perfectly, a seal that would keep out drafts better than any chinking. "It fits, Ben, tight as a drum." The technical success gave Arthur a momentary surge of pride, a quiet triumph that warmed him more than the sun. He wasn't just stacking wood, he was engineering survival. He climbed down the ladder, his legs heavy. He picked up a handful of dry moss he had gathered for insulation. "They laugh because they see the work," Arthur told Ben, gesturing to the riders disappearing around the bend. "They don't see the result yet. We work for the result." The first true test came 2 weeks later, not with snow, but with the temperature. A blue norther swept down from the territories, dropping the mercury 30 degrees in an hour. The sky turned a flat, bruised purple, and the wind began to scream in earnest. On the open plains, the cattle huddled together, tails to the wind, their breath freezing on their muzzles. In town, storekeepers scrambled to board up windows, and families burned through their woodpiles just to keep the frost off the inside of the glass. Arthur and Ben were finishing the doorframe when the front hit. The temperature plummeted, But down in the canyon cut, the violent gusts passed overhead, skipping the depression like a stone over water. Arthur ushered Ben inside the enclosure. It wasn't finished. The floor was still packed earth, but the 3 log walls and the massive stone rear wall were sealed. Arthur lit the cast-iron stove he had wrestled into place the day before. He hadn't finished the stone jacket yet, but the fire roared to life, the draft pulling smoke up the chimney pipe that Arthur had threaded through a natural fissure in the rock. The effect was almost immediate. The stillness inside was startling compared to the auditory violence of the wind above. Arthur watched the thermometer he had hung on a support post. It held steady. He sat on a crate, watching Ben hold his hands out to the stove. The light from the firebox danced on the limestone back wall, illuminating the ancient layers of sediment. It felt safe. It felt solid. For the first time in 2 years, Arthur felt a loosening in the knot of anxiety that lived constantly in his gut. He thought of Mary again, picturing her sitting across from him. She would have liked the smell of the pine resin and the stone dust. She would have laughed at the neighbors. "It's ugly, Arthur," she would have teased, "but it's ours." He closed his eyes, listening to the fire pop. The romance of the moment wasn't in flowers or poetry. It was in the successful retention of heat, in the safety of his son. It was a love letter written in structural integrity. By early December, the warnings began to circulate. An old trapper named Silas— no, not Silas. That name was common, but Arthur knew him as Old Man Miller— came down from the high country with a look of genuine fear in his eyes. He stopped by the canyon not to mock, but to warn. Miller's mule was laden with furs, and the old man's beard was already frosted with ice. "Arthur," Miller croaked, his voice raspy from decades of cold air, "you got that boy secure? The wolves are moving down. The elk are bunching up in the deep timber. I haven't seen signs like this since '88. Arthur walked out to meet him, wiping grease from his hands. "We're tight, Miller. Roof is on, gaps are sealed." Miller looked at the structure, really looked at it for the first time. He noted the way the roof tucked under the overhang, the way the walls seemed to grow out of the cliff. He didn't laugh. He nodded slowly. "The rock, that's smart. The ground freezes, but the rock deep down stays steady. You might just make it." He leaned down from his saddle. "But there's a big one coming. A white death. The air smells like metal. You get your wood in, all of it. Don't rely on gathering later." Arthur took the warning to heart. For the next 3 days, he and Ben did nothing but haul timber. They scavenged deadfall from the creek bed, dragging logs up the slope until their muscles screamed. They stacked the wood not outside, but inside, along the back stone wall, creating yet another layer of insulation and ensuring dry fuel. The cabin became a fortress of resources. The sky began to lower, pressing down on the valley like a heavy gray lid. The birds stopped singing. The silence that fell over the land was heavy, expectant, and terrified. Arthur stood in the doorway of his strange rock-hybrid home, watching the first flakes begin to spiral down. They weren't soft Christmas snow. They were hard, dry pellets that hissed when they hit the ground. The test was here. He looked back at Ben, who was reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, warm and unbothered. Arthur stepped inside and barred the heavy oak door. Let it come. The storm arrived not as weather, but as a verdict. By midnight, the world outside had ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming white void that battered the canyon walls with the force of a physical assault. Inside the cabin, however, the laws of nature seemed to have been rewritten. Arthur lay awake on his cot, listening to the wind howl 50 feet above them, a distant, enraged roaring that failed to penetrate the sanctuary of the cliff undercut. He rose quietly, stepping onto the packed earth floor in his wool socks, and moved to the thermometer. It read 65 degrees. Outside, he knew it was 20 below zero, not counting the wind chill. The physics of the thermal mass were performing exactly as he had calculated, though seeing it work felt less like engineering and more like a miracle. The massive limestone rear wall, having absorbed the stove's heat for hours, was now releasing it back into the room in a slow, steady wave. It was a radiant warmth, different from the sharp, scorching heat of a direct fire. This was a heavy, hugging warmth that seeped into the bones. Arthur walked to the stove and opened the iron door, adding a single dense log of oak. The fire didn't need to roar, it just needed to sustain the thermal battery of the rock. He looked over at Ben, who was sleeping deeply, one arm thrown over his head, the quilt kicked down to his waist because the room was so comfortable. A lump formed in Arthur's throat. He remembered the previous winter, huddled in the drafty shanty on the flats, waking up every hour to check Ben's breathing, seeing the frost on the blankets. He touched the stone wall near the bed. It was warm to the touch, like a living thing. "You'd love this, Mary," he whispered into the dim light. "You always hated the drafts." He could almost feel her presence in the room, a quiet approval that settled over him. She had been the one to teach him that stubbornness was a virtue if it was for the right reasons. This defiance of the elements, was the best reason he could imagine. The next 2 days were a blur of isolation and maintenance. The snow piled up in drifts that would have buried a standard cabin to the eaves, but the canyon's geometry worked in their favor. The wind, hitting the cliff face high above, created a back eddy that scoured the area directly in front of their door clear. While the rest of the county was being entombed, Arthur's porch remained strangely accessible. They had light, they had heat, and thanks to the indoor wood stack, they had fuel. It was a suspended reality, a pocket of survival carved out of the catastrophe. Ben spent the hours practicing his reading and helping Arthur cook stews on the stovetop, the rich smell of broth and sage filling the small space. It was domestic bliss in the heart of a frozen hell, a contrast so sharp it felt surreal, but the reality of the outside world was about to knock on their door. It happened on the afternoon of the third day. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying a sound that wasn't the gale. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping against the heavy oak planks of the door. Arthur froze, locking eyes with Ben. No one should be out in this. To be out in this was to be dead. Arthur grabbed the heavy iron bar, lifting it from the brackets, and cracked the door. A swirl of ice crystals blinded him for a second, and then a heavy, snow-caked form fell inward, collapsing onto the earthen floor. It was a horse. No, a man wrapped in buffalo robes so thick he looked like a beast. Arthur dragged him in, slamming the door against the wind and engaging the lock. He rolled the figure over. It was Henderson's foreman, a young man named Jim, his face a mask of frostbite, his eyebrows caked in ice. Arthur stripped the gloves off the man's hands, which were waxy and pale. "Ben, get the warm water basin, now!" Arthur barked, his voice snapping with command. Jim groaned, his eyes fluttering open, unfocused and terrified. "The house," Jim rasped, his teeth clattering so hard it sounded like dice in a cup. "Roof, cave-in, snow load, Henderson, the missus, trapped in the root cellar, no heat." The words hung in the warm air, a grim testament to the failure of traditional methods. Henderson's clapboard mansion, the pride of the county, had failed. The steep, strange roof Arthur had built, the one they had mocked as a bunker, was shedding snow perfectly, while the proper roofs on the flats were collapsing under the sheer weight of the White Death. Arthur didn't hesitate. The old grief for Mary had taught him that time was the only currency that mattered in a crisis. He looked at Ben. "Stay here. Keep the fire steady. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Ben nodded, pale but steady. Arthur began to gear up, layering wool and leather. He grabbed his snowshoes, another item the neighbors had chuckled at, and a coil of rope. He wasn't going out there to gloat. He was going out there because the canyon house was no longer just a home. It was the only lifeboat left. He looked at the warmth radiating from the stone wall one last time, a silent prayer of gratitude to the geology that protected his son, and stepped out into the white scream. The journey to the Henderson Ranch was a mile of torture. The snow was waist deep in the drifts, and the wind felt like sandpaper on exposed skin. Arthur kept his head down, navigating by the fence line that was barely visible as a ripple in the snow. When he reached the Henderson place, the devastation was total. The main roof of the large 2-story house had indeed buckled. The chimney collapsed inward. The windows were blown out, dark, jagged holes in a dead structure. He found them in the root cellar around the back, a huddled mass of misery. Henderson, his wife Sarah, and their 2 young daughters were wrapped in every blanket they owned, shivering violently in the dark. The temperature in the cellar was dropping fast. Henderson looked up as Arthur kicked the cellar door open, the lantern light revealing a face stripped of all arrogance. He looked aged, broken, and terrified. "Arthur," he whispered, as if seeing a ghost, we thought you'd be dead." Arthur didn't waste breath on "I told you so's." "My place is warm," he said, his voice flat and practical. "Move, now." The evacuation was a brutal slog. Arthur tied a guideline between himself and Henderson, carrying the youngest girl on his back. They moved like a caterpillar through the drifts, blind and freezing. But as they neared the canyon rim, the wind shifted. They dropped down the trail, slipping and sliding on the scree, and suddenly the wind died. The protection of the cliff wall was instant. When Arthur opened the door to his cabin, the blast of heat that escaped was so tangible it felt like a physical blow to the freezing neighbors. They stumbled inside, gasping as the 60-degree air hit their frozen lungs. Ben was there, immediately moving to help Sarah into a chair near the stove. The transition was shocking. One minute they were dying in a dark hole. The next they were in a dry, lit room that smelled of pine and stone. Henderson stood in the center of the room, snow melting off his coat in puddles, staring at the back wall. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the limestone. It was warm. He pulled his hand back, then touched it again, bewildered. "The rock," he stammered. "The rock is hot." "It's a thermal battery, Thomas," Arthur said quietly, hanging his wet coat on a peg. He moved to the stove to pour coffee from the pot that had been keeping hot. "It stores the day. It holds the fire." He handed a tin mug to Henderson. The older man took it, his hands shaking, not just from cold, but from a complete shattering of his worldview. He looked around the room. He saw the ugly log beams sitting perfectly flush against the stone. He saw the bunker roof holding strong. He saw Ben, healthy and calm, not a shivering victim, but a host. The mockery, the jokes about the badger hole, the sneers about Arthur's grief-stricken madness, it all evaporated in the undeniable reality of the warmth. By nightfall, the cabin was crowded but comfortable. Blankets were spread on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of drying wool and coffee. The social hierarchy of the valley had been inverted. The wealthy rancher was the refugee. The eccentric widower was the savior. They ate a stew of venison and potatoes, scraping the bowls clean. Henderson sat near the stove, watching the flames flicker in the glass window of the iron box. He looked over at Arthur, who was sharpening a knife by the lantern light. "I told him you were digging a tomb," Henderson said, his voice rough with shame. The room went silent. Sarah reached out and touched her husband's arm, but he didn't stop. "I said you were crazy with grief, that you were hurting the boy." Arthur stopped sharpening, the scrape of the stone ceasing. He looked at Henderson, his expression mild. There was no anger in him, only the tired peace of a man who has proven his work. Grief changes a man, Thomas. Sometimes it breaks him. Sometimes it clears his vision. I couldn't keep Mary warm. I wasn't going to let that happen to Ben. He looked at the stone wall, the rugged, uneven surface that was currently saving 6 lives. The wind doesn't care about how things used to be done. It only cares about what works. Henderson nodded slowly, a humility settling into his features that had never been there before. It works, Arthur. God help me, it works. The storm broke 2 days later. The sun emerged blindingly bright, reflecting off a world that had been scoured clean. When they finally opened the door, the valley was a sea of white, broken only by the dark scar of the canyon and the thin plume of smoke rising steadily from Arthur's chimney. The Henderson family stood on the porch, blinking in the light. They were alive. They were warm, and they were looking at the landscape with new eyes. The rescue of the Henderson family rippled through the community faster than the storm itself. When the roads were finally cleared, men rode out not to gawk, but to study. They came to see the joinery. They came to touch the warm rock. The skepticism that had defined the autumn was replaced by a studious respect. Arthur didn't lecture them. He simply showed them the stove, the draft, the orientation to the sun. He shared the knowledge freely, breaking the cycle of judgment with generosity. He wasn't hoarding the secret. He was teaching the survival. In the months that followed, canyon backing became a legitimate, if difficult, building style in the territory. Men who had laughed at the badger hole began scouting the cliff lines for their own sites. But for Arthur, the victory wasn't in the validation of the neighbors. It was in the quiet moments after the guests had gone. He stood outside one evening as the spring thaw began, watching the water drip from the icicles on the overhang. Ben was playing near the creek, shouting something at a hawk circling overhead. The boy was strong, happy, and unafraid of the cold. Arthur placed his hand on the rough bark of the door frame he had hewn himself. He thought of Mary, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of fresh loss, but with a dull, enduring ache that felt like the stone itself, heavy but capable of holding warmth. He had built a fortress out of his sorrow, and in doing so, he had saved more than just himself. He had turned the very landscape that had killed her into the thing that kept them alive. The frontier was hard, but Arthur had learned the lesson that the stone taught. You don't fight the wind, you let the earth break it for you. He turned back inside, toward the hearth, where the fire burned steady and low.